Good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone joining us from all parts of the world. Welcome to this journalists training workshop on the climate crisis within Africa-China relations. My name is Bongiwe Tutu, project coordinator of the Africa-China Reporting Project based in Johannesburg, South Africa. The Africa-China Reporting Project aims to improve the quality of reporting on Africa and Africa-China relations and issues by providing facilitation and capacity building for journalists via reporting grants, skills training workshops, and other opportunities. The Africa-China Reporting Project facilitates journalists to investigate complex dynamics and uncover untold stories with an emphasis on on-the-ground impact and perspectives to illustrate how the lives of people of Africa are changing amid the comprehensive phenomena of Africa and China interactions. And so it is a great honor and pleasure for us to be hosting this workshop in partnership with China Dialogue. And China Dialogue is a bilingual website covering China from diverse perspectives. China Dialogue is an independent, non-profit organization dedicated to promoting a common understanding of and constructive dialogue on China, its environmental challenges, and its growing role in the world. And just to introduce our panelists with us today, we are joined by Ma Tianji, who is the China Dialogue Beijing editor, who will be speaking to us on reporting the complexities of China, Africa, and the climate crisis. We're also joined by Francophone editor for the China Global South Project, Jero Nima, who will be talking about Africa's position within the climate crisis. And following Jero, we'll be having Li Shu, who's the policy advisor of Greenpeace East Asia, who will be giving us an overview and expectations of COP27. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Paula Frey, the CEO of Frey College and owner of Frey Intermedia, who will be presenting on the essentials on writing and pitching a reporting proposal. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Tom Baxter, who's the global China editor at China Dialogue, who'll be doing closing remarks and substantiating the discussion from today. So ultimately, earlier this year, within the partnership with China Dialogue, the Africa-China Reporting Project awarded reporting grants to journalists to investigate issues related to the China-Africa relationship and the climate crisis and explore topics around climate impacts, mitigation and adaptation, energy excess, energy transitions, just transitions, and the social aspects of development, critical mineral mining, especially those that are related to the global energy transition, and low carbon transportation and electrification. And it was from this call for reporting grants that the purposeful need for this workshop was realized, which is to provide further support and capacity building for journalists and professionals who are investigating and researching on how China's engagement in Africa is playing out on the ground and in the context of the climate crisis. And increasingly, China is playing a major role in the development pathways of African countries via finance and expertise in infrastructure construction, industrial projects, and other areas of economic development. And China is also engaging directly with African countries on climate action. And last year's 8th Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, issued for the first time a declaration on climate. So China is also promoting the concept of a Green Belt and Road Initiative, promising to increase its support for renewable energy. And it has also issued guidance documents for Chinese companies to promote sustainability in their overseas investment. And in November this year, the United Nations climate negotiations, which are widely billed as Africa COP, or otherwise known as COP27, will be held in Africa. And as African countries are already facing impacts of climate change and engaging in a lively conversation on low carbon development pathways and adaptation, including calling for greater availability of finance, COP27 presents an opportunity for a well-orchestrated and coordinated agenda on climate change, which lays out specific priorities and calls for support and can encourage Africans to speak with one voice. It can also strengthen the continent's international presence and negotiating power, and ultimately help it to attain its climate goals, such as attracting additional climate finance and in particular for adaptation. So this is where the importance and the effectiveness of the African Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan for 2022 to 2032, which was endorsed in February this year at the AU Heads of State Summit, can be tested, as this action plan is the continent's first collective climate response framework since 2014, when it was first drafted. And so understanding what these plans and bodies, frameworks and agreements mean for Africa and its engagement with China is crucial, particularly for journalists when investigating these issues and the relations, as journalists play the important role of informing the public. So we are beyond motivated about the great global interest that this workshop opportunity has gained, with registrations across the globe from countries in Africa, North and South America, from China, from the United States, and even as far as New Zealand. We are so honored for the outreach and the impact, and it is a great honor to have you joining us, and we hope that this workshop will be of great use to building on your knowledge and understanding. So I will now, without further ado, hand over to our first speaker, Ma Tianjie, who is presenting on reporting on the complexities of China, Africa, and the climate crisis. Ma Tianjie is the director of China Dialogue's Beijing program. Before joining China Dialogue, he was Greenpeace's program director for mainland China, where he was a regular commentator on China's environmental challenges, contributing to a range of media organizations. He holds a master's degree in environmental policy from American University, Washington, D.C. Welcome, and over to you, sir.
Thank you, Bongiwei, for the introduction. I will share my screen. So I'm very glad to have this opportunity to basically share with colleagues across the world, particularly on the African continent, on reporting basically China-Africa climate stories. And the topic was given by the organizer, which is focused on the so-called complexities. And I think I'm just going to share very briefly some of my observations, personal observations from on the ground in China, so that collectively I think we can produce the kind of stories that actually better inform and engage the global audience. First of all, I would like to share a few graphs, which basically shows the kind of tectonic changes that are ongoing in China, which is sort of shifting the economy in ways that are significant. And if we don't keep track of those key sort of tectonic shifts, we may end up writing stories about a China that was maybe 10 or 15 years ago, right? And based on sort of outdated models, outdated understanding of what's actually going on in China. So on the left side, you can see that first of all, the Chinese economy is not growing as fast as it was 10 years ago or 15 years ago. The growth rate has largely peaked around 2007 and has go down gradually since then. So the Chinese economy is definitely changing gear. It is changing towards a growth model that is slower in terms of growth quantity, but emphasizes more in terms of the growth, of the quality of the growth. And consequently, this has major implications to a lot of these sort of key indicators of economic performance, right? And one of the key area is in energy, right? With a slower growing economy, China's energy demand is also slowly cooling down. It's no longer the kind of economy that is consuming ever more and more energy and consuming ever more and more resources, right? If you look at, for example, coal consumption, it has largely plateaued, so to speak, since around 2013. So there was even 3 years where there was a pretty significant drop from the 2013 level, and there has been some sort of a rebound over the past 4 or 5 years, but still not back to the 2013 level yet. So with the plateauing of energy demand, we're seeing basically an economy that is sort of cooling down a little bit with sort of slightly less of intensive footprint, basically, particularly domestically, on a lot of the sort of resource consumption. And overseas, we're also seeing this sort of reflected, right, into China's decisions across its own boundaries. For example, if you look at Chinese investment or engagement, which includes investment and also contracts, construction contracts, in the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, the shrinking engagement is sort of quite obvious starting from almost 3 years ago, 2019, where afterwards the kind of engagement size just collapsed, so to speak. This is, of course, not just because of the sort of economic slowdown back at home, but also by factors such as COVID and also the general kind of deteriorating global economic prospects and sort of the inability of many countries to continue to absorb investments, particularly in the form of debt, right? And so if we are still talking about, for example, Chinese overseas investment as in the form of massive debt-driven big infrastructure projects, probably it's no longer the case, especially going forward, right? Because there's definitely a movement towards more cautious approaches in overseas investment in the past few years. So those facts or those trends are actually driven largely by the kind of shifting priorities, both domestically and also overseas. So domestically, as I mentioned, China is sort of determined to pursue a developmental path that emphasizes more on quality than quantity at this stage of its development. It's putting a large emphasis on building a so-called ecological civilization, which takes into account the economy's sort of efficiency of using resources such as sort of ecological resources, land, energy, and other inputs, so that it can actually produce a more sustainable developmental model. And internationally, China is also becoming obviously more risk averse. It wants to avoid the kind of massive risky projects that featured its investments over the past decade, but now emphasizes the so-called small but beautiful projects, the projects that with higher return on investment, higher quality, right? It is putting more qualifiers into the kind of overseas projects that it is still carry on, particularly going forward. So some colleagues might have the question, so if this is really going on, right, if this kind of shifts are really going on, then why am I still seeing, right, sometimes problematic projects from Chinese companies? Why, for example, in certain countries, China seems to be continuing behaving in ways that has sort of dominated the kind of patterns over the past decade or so? I think the answer to that question or an oversimplified answer to that question is that China is not a monolithic entity, right? So when we are talking about complexity, here comes the complexity. Even when China has, or the central government has policies that are trying to direct the country towards a different developmental model, there are layers and layers of different players that are sort of shaping how those kind of policies and intentions are being played out on the ground. And we're talking about at least 3 levels of players, and in reality, there are probably even more. So the central government, the provincial and local governments, and a large number of Chinese companies, many of them are state-owned companies, and even more of them are actually private companies. And within the state-owned companies, you also have the so-called centrally owned companies versus the so-called provincially owned or even locally owned companies. And although all of those entities has different incentives in the game, basically, and they are sort of collectively shaping how China sort of behaves overseas, and sort of determining what certain projects, the direction of certain projects, where it goes, right? And I'm going to use just one case, a recent case, to just demonstrate how this kind of complexity plays out in this field of climate change. So back in September last year, China made this pretty unprecedented announcement by President Xi Jinping that it is not going to build new coal-fired power plants overseas anymore, right? So this was a big announcement made at the United Nations last year. And if you think that overnight, right, China is going to just, all the constructions that are ongoing across the world by Chinese companies on coal-fired power plants are just going to stop once and for all, right? That's probably a too sort of simplistic understanding of what this announcement means, right? So what actually played out after the announcement is that there was quite a few months, weeks or months, where there was genuine confusion as to what this policy really, or what this announcement really mean in reality. To some extent, this announcement at the very top level of the government was sort of a surprise to many sort of lower level policymakers, and they need to spend time just to hash out the actual details of this policy. And one of such detail is how new is new, right? Because there were at the time of the announcement, there were multiple projects that are in the pipeline, right, which was not built yet, but they have reached certain stages of the development. Either they have already raised the fund for the project, or they have reached agreements, they have signed contracts, right? So at that point, there was a big, I think, policy discussion within the Chinese government about where to cut the line, right? How new is new? Where should they draw the line of stopping the construction and building, right? And after that was to some extent resolved, details emerged over the past few months, then still the central government would need to find a leverage, right, or an enforcer of this policy. And one of the most powerful enforcers the central government can rely on is actually the banks, right, the financial sector that was still more or less very much aligned with government policy and to some extent controlled by government. So it was Chinese banks, particularly the state-owned banks, that were the first mover or enforcer of this no new coal pledge made by President Xi at the UN, which means that for a lot of the projects that are trying to secure funding from Chinese banks, right, they probably will get a no, and the lack of funding would lead to the stop of a large amount of projects overseas because of the policies of the banks. But still, even in such cases, there are still loopholes, or so-called, there are still companies that are trying to bypass, right, this kind of policies just because in some cases, building a coal-fired power plant for a country or for a client still makes money, right, for them. And particularly for Chinese companies that do not rely on Chinese bank financing, for example. Either they can pay it out of their own pocket as investment, or they were paid fully, right, by a client. Right? In those cases, there are still incentives for Chinese companies to pursue a coal-fired power project overseas, even after the top-level policy announcement. So on the ground, what we are seeing is that totally contradictory stories may be true, right, at the same time, right? So in Zimbabwe, for example, ICBC, one of China's largest state-owned banks, has basically pulled away from a previously committed financing for coal-fired power plants, right? Because, as I mentioned, the banking sector was sort of the first mover and really the enforcer of high-level government policy in this case. But on the other hand, you're still also seeing cases where, for example, in certain industrial parks in Indonesia, there might still be some coal-fired power plants projects ongoing because it's a private company and they probably don't need Chinese bank financing for that project to materialize. Right? So both stories on this slide can be true just because it's a complex dynamics even after a top-level policy intention was made clear. And there are still plenty of players that can sort of jig the game in ways that favors their own interest. So I think for colleagues here who is sort of attending this workshop, I think there is a very big role that journalists, particularly from host countries in Africa, can play, right, in sort of shaping China's Green Belt and Road initiative, because like the No New Coal pledge, those policies are still waiting to be hashed out, right, waiting to be actually becoming more detailed and implementable on the ground. China has, over the past few months, released multiple guidelines and opinions by the central government on greening the Belt and Road. Many of them are sort of principled language, overall kind of directions. But still, the players, as I mentioned before, will need to live out, right, and make sense of some of those directives on the ground. And in those cases, if journalists and reporters can identify loopholes in the implementation, highlight sort of contradictions in the implementation or opportunities, right, in implementing some of those initiatives. This will actually help make the Green Belt and Road pledge more real on the ground. I think that's sort of the mission of a lot of us here, who is reporting and doing stories on China's footprint in Africa and beyond. And thank you. This is my sharing today.
Thank you very much, Marty and Jeff, for that informative presentation and giving that example of the events that followed after Xi Jinping's announcements. And thank you also for informing us of these new trends and the shifting narratives and how they are affecting these complex dynamics and the essential tools, the essential know-how for journalists when they're reporting on these complex dynamics. We'll now be handing over to our second speaker, Jerome, who's the Francophone editor of the China Global South Project, will be giving us the understandings around Africa's position within the climate crisis. And Jerome is an analyst and observer of China-Africa relations, who has graduated from Renmin University of China and has a master's degree in international development from the International University of Japan. He researched natural resources, revenue management, and previously he worked as a project manager for the small Congolese mining company in the DRC, and later as a consultant on good governance and policy advocacy for the Center of Studies for Social Action. currently Francophone editor of the China Global South Project and a senior associate, a non-resident at the Africa program for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Jero, thank you, and over to you.
Thank you, Bongere, for having me today for this webinar. I'm going to be sharing my screen. So I've been asked to talk about the climate crisis in Africa and the role that Africa is playing in all that crisis. Basically, we're going to be talking about energy transition and China's position in Africa in that regard. So in the first part, we're going to be sharing the basic information we already know about China, about climate change in Africa, and later on we're going to be looking at what China is doing in Africa in terms of climate change and energy transition. So in terms of global gas greenhouse emission, we know that Africa is the less polluter of all entities in the world, despite being 1.3 billion population, still contributes much less than the United States, Japan, China, and European Union in terms of pollution. So Africa has a great need of energy, but also as in terms of producing CO2 emissions, is the less polluter among all the actors in the world. In terms of climate change, we know that, as I said before, Africa is disproportionately experiencing the negative effect of climate change in Africa, including water stress. We've been seeing flood in East Africa. The last 2 years, we've been seeing that. We see reduced food production. We see increasingly frequency of extreme weather in different parts of the continent. But we also see how climate change amplifies instability in Africa. The data, the research made by Africa Center of Strategic Studies have shown how much this have impacted in terms of political instability, in terms of piracy in the west coast of Africa. We've also seen that Africa is the world lowest level of per capita use of modern energy. That really impacts Africa in terms of economic development, industrialization process. There is that need of having much more energy, but also there is that need of Africa kind of reassessing its position, and although it's a less polluter of all, but growing to that energy transition to be much more effective, to have more sustainable energy features in this program. In terms of impact, we've seen that, as I mentioned before, we've seen the recent flood in East Africa, the impact that it had in different part of in East Africa, in different countries, Ethiopia, Somalia, Kenya. We also see the effect of climate change on Africa. We see the fish scares in West Africa, the weather trade mills, the Sahel has been 25% decrease in terms of rainfall. We've seen all over the continent various cases of impact of climate change on the continent, and the continent is one of the most affected by climate change, always the least polluter among all the nations in the world, among different actors in the world. The climate change also amplifies instability in Africa. I said before, in Sahel, in Gulf of Guinea, in Sudan, we see human displacement. In forests in Congo Basin, in Central Africa, the Congo Basin forest has been decreasing. We've seen many companies being involved in logging in the region. And in Mozambique also, we also see that case where we see now instability in the east part of Mozambique happening because of climate change, how it's impacted the region. In terms of energy crisis, we know that Africa has a huge potential in terms of different sources of energy. We have wind, nuclear, thermal, geothermal, and solar thermal hydraulic potential. We have many countries as the DRC having a lot of water capacity being able to have hydroelectrical power. We also have nuclear capacity in South Africa. In Southern Africa, we have geothermal capacity in the east part of Africa. We also have thermal capacity in other part. We also have solar capacity in the northern part of Africa. There is so much potential that needs to be tapped in, where we need a lot of investment and presence, where Africa can really gain into in terms of renewable energy presence and investment. In terms of Africa energy crisis, what do we know? What's the fact that we know? We know that we have 600 million people without access to electricity. We also have population incoming growing. The demand for modern energy is expanding. By 2030, we're going to see that that demand growing fast. We also see that there's a demand in terms of energy in the industry. That demand is going to increase by 40% by 2030. Africa is also the home of 60% of best solar resource globally, yet only 1% install or solar PV capacity on the continent. I'm going to go down there later on. I'm going to be explaining what's happening in that sector. Africa has almost unlimited potential of solar capacity, abundant hydro, wind, and geothermal energy sources. Renewable, including solar, wind power, and geothermal, account for 80% of new power generation capacity to 2030. And we see that potential being really groomed by Africa, and we see a lot of investment coming in, but not as much as we would expected to see that happening. In terms of production of oil and gas, it still remains one of very essential to Africa economic and social development. Although we see a lot of withdrawal in terms of in that area, but we know that Africa has a lot of potential in terms of oil and gas. We're gonna see what's up. We're gonna see the gas potential that we see in Mozambique. We see also the oil capacity that we see in Nigeria, in Angola. They're also essential parts of African economic development. And when we see the war in Ukraine, and we see how Europe is trying to diversify its source of oil and gas, we see that there is still a potential for Africa there. And this is where the conundrum comes from many African countries, where even for Africa itself, in terms of the place of oil and gas in that development. The energy crisis across the continent hinders Africa economic development. And the data shows that there is a 2 to 4% of GDP annually are impacted because of the lack of proper energy on the continent. But Africa has also a lot of potential, because Africa accounts for 40% of global reserve of cobalt, manganese, and platinum, key minerals for batteries and hydrogen technology. Those are key elements in energy transition, and this is where Africa has a card to play. There is a huge potential that Africa has to foster in that regard. In terms of renewable potential, I already showed that before. I should already show that ahead. So what do we have in terms of China and Africa in terms of climate change cooperation? We know that both China and Africa, they have put in place the China-Africa Environmental Cooperation Center based in Nairobi. The center is supposed to be a forum for environmental policy interaction, clearing house for information exchange, a platform for capacity development support, a catalyst for joint environmental program and project, and platform for mobilization of funds for environmental projects that will contribute toward Africa development priorities. In terms of the second element, it's what we had during the last FOCAC in last November, the 8th FOCAC, the declaration, the China-Africa Partnership on Strategic Cooperation on New Area for the fight against climate change. A lot of highlights have been given. Here you're gonna see the highlights of it, but due to time, I'm not gonna read it. I'm gonna be sharing the presentation, so you're gonna be seeing those highlights. But we see that, for example, China has declared has already launched 100 clean energy and green development project under the FOCAC to support African countries better utilizing solar, hydropower, wind, and biogas. We see that China is also pulling out from new coal-fired power projects, and Matienzi already mentioned it. And we even see that because it's that China pulling out from that area has been shown, for example, in South Africa, where China is pulled away from the Limpopo free economic zone project they were building over there. But when it comes now to China in Africa in terms of minor energy and clean energy transition, what do we know? We know that China has put something around 43 billion over investing in energy in Africa. It has the single largest investment portfolio on the continent. And between 20 and 2010, China has invested a lot in hydropower projects on the continent. Hydropower projects are the major project where China is investing on renewable energy. But beside the hydropower, we don't see a lot of Chinese presence in solar or wind, although we have big projects in Ethiopia, in South Africa, and now one project being built in Zambia. We know that China is expected to extend to be involved in nearly 70% of hydropower projects on the continent, and main contractor in renewable energy in main contractors in renewable project in Africa are state-owned companies that are backed by policy bank from China. And finally, we see also how China is moving away from financing core project, and it's been already mentioned before. So we have here various cases: the Adama wind farm in Ethiopia, the Garissa solar project in Kenya, and the Dar wind farm in South Africa, the wind farm in South Africa. So what are the challenges that we face in terms of renewable financing in Africa? We've noticed there's a relatively low funding and financing in renewable energy projects in Africa. Why? Because there is a lack of bankable projects. Most projects are hill-packed, are not well presented. So there is that problem for many financing body, being DFIs, being bilateral partners or strategic companies and financing companies and financing banks. And when you have institutions like Policy Bank from China, who are now more careful about big projects, you understand that the risk that those big projects present are quite high for those banks to come into funding those projects. We have regulatory and policy barrier that we've seen being across the continent, because for many African continents, energy is still a state-owned controlled sector. So many countries are opening up to private sector still, where a lot of implementation needs to be made in terms of law, in terms of regulation. We have poorly structured and packaged projects that needs to be improved by government, and enabling environment. Enabling environment is one of the biggest problem and challenge that we see, because you have bad governance, you have corruption, you have lack of solid infrastructure. You can build a power project, but how are you going to connect it to the main grid? You have a transportation issue, distribution issue that needs to be addressed by many African countries. So in terms of now minor energy transition, this is where Africa has a tremendous card to play, because we see that the minerals that you're going to need for energy transition, you're going to have lithium, cobalt that are used in power in electrical vehicle batteries. That's really needed today in terms of energy transition. We're going to have molybdenum, we're going to have chromium and aluminum, and Africa is home for many of those natural resources. We have countries like South Africa, DRC with cobalt, Zimbabwe with lithium. We have so many countries that have that opportunity today to raise to the challenge and become main partners in that energy transition. But we also see that China is very dominating in terms of processing, because China is processing most of those natural resources. Now the challenges for Africa is how to create a value chain on the continent. The solution can be through pooling resources to create a continental value chain through Africa Free Trade Agreement. We see that resources can be pulled from South Africa. You can see countries can share can share the energy crisis, can share the energy to create a value chain on some other country. We can see South Africa can help to process lithium and cobalt coming from DRC and Zimbabwe. There is a need to creating an enabling environment for local value chain. And China, as you see, as I said before, China is the major player in those countries, and China has a role also to play. This is where China is facing a new conundrum, because it sees that in DRC, in Zimbabwe, in Guinea, producing countries are asking to have a local value chain for them on their countries. This is now a challenge for China, how China needs to adapt in that new environment, and how African countries need to create environment for those Chinese investment to create those value chain in Africa. And I'm going to finish with some tips to understand how to better cover China and Africa in terms of energy transition. We need to understand Chinese global stance and position on climate change and the energy transition, better understand China internal situation on climate change and impact and its own impact on China's engagement elsewhere, and in this case, specifically in Africa, understand China's economic change and evolution, understand Africa's energy needs, challenge, opportunities, and in the energy transition. And we also have to understand the geopolitics of energy transition, because there is a major geopolitics issue in that situation that we need to understand to grasp if we want to report more accurately on these issues, and China engagement in Africa, how it fits Africa's situation. We also need to understand the Chinese actors involved in the energy transition in Africa, which are the policy banks, the central government, and different entities that come into play, how they play the game in Africa, and how we need to engage with them, understanding China energy's financing and approaches, and of course dig into more academic research on the topic to have much more understanding of the situation. And here you have some useful resource that you can find, the database on Boston University, for Boston University on global energy finance, and different database that you can find Chinese details on China's being involved and how China is financing climate change and energy transition in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Thank you, and this is my part for today. I'm going to be waiting for Q&A to address some questions that we may have.
Thank you very much, Jérôme, for that very informative, interesting African perspective on the issues that African countries are facing and the engagements with China, and also the potentials and opportunities that exist within our renewables and within the investments that are required in the financing around geothermal, wind, and solar, and those examples that you've provided for the case countries of Ethiopia, Kenya, and South Africa, and also the element of having a value production within the continent, which is, I think, very important, a continental value chain within the mining materials that are produced in the continent. And also within the end of your presentation, the tips and the resources that you provide, I think, really tie everything so well together, and I think very useful for journalists and researchers who want to look into those cases in Africa. So thank you so much for that. And now we'll be handing over to our third speaker, Mr. Li Shu. Before I do that, I just want to remind our attendees that you can present your questions or comments in the Q&A section or the chat function here on Zoom. We've noted that some of you have raised your hands. Please kindly just keep your hands raised, and we'll address your questions within the Q&A session. So now to hand over to Li Shu, who is a senior global policy advisor at Greenpeace China. Mr. Li Shu leads the organization's engagement with multilateral environmental agreements, including the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Mr. Li also supports Greenpeace's advocacy for better ocean governance under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. various regional fishery management organizations, and the Antarctic Treaty. Domestically, Mr. Lee directs the organization's policy campaign on a wide range of issues, including air pollution, water, renewable energy, and fishery. Thank you, Mr. Lee. Over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Bunky, for having me, and also thanks for China Dialogue for your invitation. I will talk about the UN Climate Summit, COP27, in the next 10 minutes or so, and I plan to make 4 brief points. My first point is just to help everybody contextualize COP27 a little bit. COP27 will be indeed one of the most important international climate events that we will have this year. It is scheduled under an African leadership, country of Egypt, in mid-November this year. In the past, within the UN climate negotiations, various African countries have played very important roles in steering international climate diplomacy. For example, in 2011, we had the COP in South Africa, which resulted in something called the Durban Mandate, which was widely perceived as the starting point of negotiating and finally adopting the landmark Paris Agreement. I think the most important thing for colleagues to understand here is when we look at UN climate negotiations, the negotiations themselves are undergoing a quite important transition. A transition from negotiating and discussing ambition to implementation. In other words, a debate or a discussion around what countries should do as in their climate targets, how much they should, reduce their emissions, or, for rich countries, how much they should, how much finance they should provide to developing countries to actually delivering those commitments. And indeed, after years of negotiations, primarily focusing on adopting, climate rules at the global level, I think the critical issue now with regard to international climate politics is moving to the country level, what countries are doing domestically in their implementation. So I think the bottom line message here is increasingly countries' domestic climate action will be as important as the international negotiations. Having that said, and my second point is the negotiations in Egypt later this year will still see a number of very important issues to be addressed. If you look at the history of UN climate negotiations, the previous sessions and COPs have resulted in 2 pairs of imbalance, in my view. One imbalance is the imbalance between the issue of mitigation and adaptation. So to reduce emissions versus how to adopt or respond to the impacts of climate change. The other pair of imbalance is the imbalance between ambition and climate finance. COP27 will address these 2 pairs of imbalance by advancing 3 important issues, namely climate finance, climate adaptation, and something called loss and damage. Specifically, when it comes to climate finance, many colleagues may know that back in 2009, industrialized countries have pledged to provide at least $100 billion to developing countries by 2020. That promise, up until this day, has largely been unfulfilled. So the task of COP27 is to basically urge industrialized countries to catch up with the commitment that they made. The COP will also discuss, in addition to the quantity of climate finance, the quality of it. Namely, how can we better balance finance that goes into mitigation and adaptation, and also how can we strengthen or enhance the share of grants in international climate finance vis-a-vis other forms, such as loans. So that's, I think, those are the kind of key finance-related issues at COP27. Moving to adaptation, this issue has long been neglected vis-a-vis the issue of mitigation. I think comparatively speaking, adaptation is a much more diffuse issue. It is hard to attract finance, and it is also an issue that is highly regional or national specific. But I think many of us are indeed hoping to use the opportunity presented by an African COP to make progress on this critical issue that is dear to the heart of many African countries. A key issue that will be negotiated in Egypt is a future global goal for adaptation. Moving to the third issue, loss and damage. The idea of loss and damage is, we as a global community is clearly lacking behind, progress needed when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. So unfortunately, there will be losses and damages associated with climate impacts. Should rich countries provide in a straightforward way a compensation to climate vulnerable countries when they encounter those losses and damages? This has been a highly political and politicized issue within UN climate negotiations. For years, this issue has been stalled as a result of resistance and oppositions from industrialized countries. But the issue is also gaining momentum among developing countries, in particular vulnerable countries such as island developing countries and many African countries as well. And I think the global climate community is indeed hoping for more concrete progress to be made on this particular issue. Specifically, whether a dedicated financial mechanism can be created to address loss and damage. Moving to my third point, I just talked about the policy issues around the COP, but I think it is also important for us to look at the politics around COP27. I think it is quite notable when we look at international climate politics, the conditions in recent years are quite different from 6 or 7 years ago when the Paris Agreement was reached. If we look at around the world, China's relationship with the West, in particular the United States and European countries, have deteriorated. We have an ongoing hot war in between Russia and Ukraine, and the COVID pandemic is still, affecting different parts of the world. And all of this generate risks of economic recession, inflation, energy, and food crisis. And I think the global climate agenda will not be insulated from those global turbulence. If we look at, for example, the European countries, they are actively reconciling or wrestling between their climate ambition and their energy security concerns. The US has also suffered very recent climate setbacks with the failure to pass the so-called Build Back Better Act in Congress and the Supreme Court ruling on the case of EPA versus West Virginia. And China is also distracted on its climate ambition, largely because of the domestic COVID and economic difficulties. Adding on top of all of this is this persistent tension between northern countries and southern countries within the UN climate framework. I think all of this geopolitical clouds, if you will, will make COP27 a highly contentious meeting, and we will see a lot of the geopolitical issues come to the fore later this year in Egypt. Let me just conclude with a few words on China. I think compared to COP26, the climate summit that we had last year in Glasgow, China's role in this climate negotiations this year might be a little bit less prominent. And this is partly because of the issues that will be debated at this COP. As I mentioned, primarily adaptation, finance, and loss and damage. Those issues, I think we will see in general a position from China as offering solidarity with other developing country partners, but not probably being right under the spotlight as the way it was in Glasgow. But still, the country will be quite important for the success of the COP. I will pay close attention to the EU-China engagement in the run-up to the COP, but also US-China climate engagement. At home, a very important issue is whether China will commit to any new climate pledges at all this year. If we recall what happened last year, as previous speakers have already mentioned, China committed to no more coal project overseas. And the year before, the carbon neutrality and carbon peaking pledge was made. Whether there will be similar announcement this year, I think is a big question mark. And also of critical relevance to other developing countries. And also, as other speakers have already mentioned, is the issue of the implementation of the overseas coal moratorium. Will we see loopholes in its execution? And probably also, more importantly, is whether China will find ways to scale up its support on renewable energy sources to much of the developing world. I think those are the issues for all of us to watch from a Chinese perspective in the run-up to COP27. And with that, let me turn it back to you, Bunhui. I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Li Shuo, for that perspective, for the lessons that we can draw from COP26 as we anticipate COP27. And thank you for sharing that analysis of the two pairs of imbalance that could come up within the COP27 deliberations, and the issues around mitigation and adaptation, and the ambitions around those, and also the concern of loss and damage and the issues that relate to that, and whether it is the responsibility of the rich nations to support vulnerable and developing countries when they are when they've been impacted by climate crises. Also, I think it's very informative how you relate these anticipations as we draw closer to COP27. And it's very informative to guide journalists as to what they can look forward to, how they can be already framing their assessments and their investigations and their research as they're going to be reporting around COP27 in November. So that analysis is very informative and very useful. And we've been getting a lot of questions within our Q&A and comments of our attendees asking whether the presentations will be shared after the webinar. And yes, we will be compiling a report which will consist of all the panelists' presentations along with the video of the entire recording, as it's going to be a very useful resource to look into reporting on the climate crisis and how it impacts Africa-China relations. And I like also what you presented on what we can expect from China within COP27, whether they will be committing to any new climate policies, and whether China will fund or find rather ways to scale up its support for renewables in Africa. So thank you so much for that analysis and perspective. And we're sure it will be very useful as we draw into COP27. And now to our final panelist, Paula Frey. Paula is the CEO of Frey College and the owner of Frey Intermedia. She is a South African entrepreneur and media development trainer, and she was also the first female editor of South Africa's Saturday Star newspaper. Paula has been recognized with several awards in her outstanding career, including the Sanif Stephen Rotsley Award, and she continues to build and impart essential knowledge and skills training focused on sub-Saharan Africa with consultancy work in MENA and Asia, and is a coach and mentor to media leaders, including publishers, editors, business, and newsroom managers in Africa. Paula, thank you so much, and over to you.
Thank you very, very much, Bangiwe. And I'll keep it tight so that we've got some time for questions afterwards, and allow other people to be able to speak. So I'm going to be speaking on writing and pitching your proposal. And really, the opportunities that we have with COP27 really provide us with the potential to be able to just share again. I don't think it's sharing. Apologies. Let me try again. COP27 really gives us an opportunity to be able to tell some critical stories about climate change within the context of China in Africa and China-Africa relationships. And really the last call that was made by the Africa-China Reporting Project, I mean, garnered over 100 applications, and still has an opportunity. I think the first round has been reviewed and the second round is being reviewed. And so if you haven't received feedback yet, you can wait until that second round is actually reviewed. What we want to do today, though, is to talk about what people are looking for when they are reviewing your proposal, and therefore what the kinds of things that you should consider when you're writing a proposal. First of all, I like to say, and this is absolutely true, as someone who's reviewed proposal applications for Africa-China Reporting Project, as well as the International Women's Media Foundation and a whole host of other organizations. Good proposal writing is like writing a good story. You really want your proposal to be targeted to the audience. So it's targeted to the person who's going to be reviewing it and to the organization that is actually giving the grant making. It is well researched. Too often, the proposal includes a request for support in order to do research. But if you haven't done some basic research on the story that you want to be doing, it's really difficult to assess whether or not you do, in fact, have a story that's worth pursuing. A good proposal is written logically. It sets out the problem, it sets out the story that you're considering doing, and then it, in a very, very logical way, explains how you're going to embark on actually developing that story. It's clearly presented. It really does help you to have subheadings. It really does help you to be able to in your proposal outline, to make sure that that people at a glance would be able to see the critical things. And then obviously a good proposal meets deadlines, just like a good story. So we know that the last round of proposal calls for the Africa-China Reporting Project got over 100 applications. So you really need to think about the fact that the competition is really very steep. And because of that, you need to start off by making sure you've got the basics right. Read the application requirements, right? Exactly what is the funder asking for? What kind of stories are they asking for? What kind of documentation do they want? What kind of support addenda do they want, etc.? So what often happens is that when there are a lot of applications, the very first way that they reduce the number of applications to consider is by removing all of the people who don't meet the basic requirements, who have not submitted all the documentation, who have not put it into the format that is required, who've not even made it by the right deadline. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that you're not writing it for one person, you're writing it for a panel. A good writer knows that you can never assume the knowledge and understanding of the audience, that your story or your proposal must always include the knowledge, the information that the reader needs in order to make sense of it. You might understand why a particular story is really important in your country. You might understand why a particular story is big news in your country. But if you don't give that context, if you don't explain that to the person or the panel that is reviewing your proposal, it's unlikely they will have the same urgency. You saw that today's presentation, for example, is being attended by people across the African continent and even beyond. So imagine a panel that is reviewing applications from across Africa. They really are looking at stories from different countries, and it's up to you as the person writing the proposal to give them the right context, the right background, and the right analysis. And then tick off, make a list of what the requirements are in the call for proposals, and make sure that you are actually looking at that, and that you are in your written proposal meeting, certainly giving all of those requirements. The Africa-China reporting project requires successful proposals submitted by journalists to be relevant and focused, and to be detailed and thorough. This is not a cut and paste application. This really is to be able to look very clearly at the call for proposals and make sure, for example, that you are clearly making a proposal that meets the requirement, for example, of climate-focused reporting on how Africa's engagement, how China's engagement in Africa is playing out on the ground in the context of the climate crisis. You have to make sure that your proposal is directly linked to that. When we say relevant and focused, right, it means it must be broadly aligned to what the Africa-China reporting project is actually calling for. It must be focused on the specific project. It must make use of communities or individuals on the ground to really tell the story of on-the-ground impact and perspectives. We want to see stories that reflect the impact on people in Africa, not theoretical research only, but also really bringing in the human interest detail there as much as possible. What do we mean when we say that proposals for the Africa-China reporting project need to be detailed and thorough? Well, first of all, it really needs to be well organized. You need to clearly organize the information, and you need to outline, right, have a clear focus and outline what your proposal is about. Having a headline at the start that really effectively tells the reader what the investigation is going to do. Having an intro that really explains or highlights the importance of your story in the current situation is really important. And then having a really carefully considered and clear methodology of how your reporting is going to unfold is important. By clear methodology, I mean you really do need to have a feasible plan. So not an unrealistic plan that cannot be achieved within the budget or the time frame. You need to have a feasible, clear plan for how your investigation will be undertaken. Where possible, you need to include specific sources, people that you've already identified for the interviews. You need to be able to outline what kind of interviews you're going to be looking at, right? What you expect to get from different sources. You don't really want to be submitting a proposal to say very vaguely what you're going to do. You want to submit a proposal that lets you stand out amongst the other proposals by showing that you have really thought through the story and that you are ready to go as soon as the funding is agreed. If you can, you should include specific places or areas that you want to visit and say why you want to visit that. If you're asking for travel budget, say why it's important to have that travel in order to achieve what you want to achieve for your story. And where you can, identify even the documentation that you want to be able to achieve. Listening to our speakers today, it is quite clear that there is a whole host of really interesting stories that are still unreported on this theme, whether we're talking about climate impacts, mitigation and adaptation, whether we're talking about energy access, whether we're talking about mineral minings, particularly those related to the global energy transition, whether we're talking about low carbon transportation and electrification. There is a wealth of stories out there that remain untold. Yet very often, the stories that are being put forward in proposals are the same old stories. So when we're looking at the art of writing good proposals, the idea is really key. The questions you ask in order to generate that idea is really key. And so what we really want to be able to do is to have an idea that stands out, an idea that really is unique, is different from what everyone else is going to be given. So step number one to a good proposal is a really good idea. Unusual, different, it's not been done before, or if it has been done before, you really are proposing to do it differently and to bring a lot more value to the story that you want to tell. The second thing of writing a good proposal is that you must do your initial research. You must ensure that you show the panel that's reviewing your proposal that there is a feasible story, that you have already invested some time and effort into it, and that the story does in fact exist. Nobody wants to give funding for a story that might actually prove not to be a story at all. The third thing to be looking at is your story plan. Do you have a clear idea of how your reporting is going to unfold, how you might actually tell the story, how you might use social media or multi-platform elements to make the story more compelling and more interesting? And then what is your story focus? Show the reviewer that you are clear and that you are focused about the story guidelines. Then, what about making it stand out? Then, you want your proposal to be attention grabbing. You want it to stand out. Well, there are 100 proposals. You want to make sure that your proposal actually stands out. You want to make sure that your proposal offers a story that's going to stand out. And so really, just as you would with a story, have a hook, right? Have a first paragraph or an opening that really hooks the audience. If you can, identify an attention-grabbing headline that will make your proposal memorable. Organize your argument in a way that it is very logical and that the person who's reviewing it has a clear idea of what you want to achieve. Avoid irrelevant information. Too often, proposals have a lot of bump that add lots of words to it, but don't necessarily add a lot of compelling information. So cut it down. Just as you would cut down your story to keep it focused, cut down your proposal to make sure that it focuses on the key things you want. At the same time, though, I don't want your proposal to be too long, but also not to be too short. There needs to be sufficient detail in your proposal to make sure that you have a coherent and persuasive case as to why your proposal should be funded, as to why your story should really be given the funding that will allow you to tell the story. And so let me re-emphasize, please don't send in obvious story ideas, right? Don't send in a story idea that you do every day in your office, that you get up and that you can do without additional funding. If you're asking for specific funding, then make the story worthwhile and tell the donor very specifically why the story is worth funding, why the story is, worth looking at. Whether it is the first time the story is going to be done in such depth, the potential impact of the story, the potential impact of the story on discussions, the fact that the story is underreported. You really do need to make sure that you are very clear in terms of why the story needs to be done, what makes this particular story unique as much as possible. When you're doing a proposal, please don't have a shotgun approach. Don't have a proposal template, and every time someone asks for proposals, you send through the same story idea. Be very targeted about what you're asking, right? Make sure that you understand the funders, why the funder is actually requesting particular proposals, what kind of stories the funder is looking for. If you're doing it for the Africa reporting, African and China reporting projects, make sure that you've read through the submission requirements, and make sure that you do a compelling argument. So what don't you want to do? What you don't want to do is to have a proposal that does not show any impact, that doesn't show why the story is important, that doesn't show why your proposed investigation is really important. Then don't do a proposal that has no prior research. Do enough research to show that your story is feasible. More importantly, show familiarity with the topic and with the issue at hand so that you can frame it appropriately within your local and even with an African-wide context. Do not send in a proposal that shows you don't know what you're talking about. It's really, really important that you at least understand the language of the issue you're talking about and the key point of the issue. So if you're selling your story, just like you would sell your story to a funder, you also need to sell your story to your news editor. The so what, right? The so what, why should I care, is so important. Show why your story is important, what critical information will be unearthed, and what the potential impact is. Identify your sources, the ones that you've already approached, and the one that you will approach once you get support from the funder. And then strike, when you're writing your proposal and even when you're briefing your editor, strike the right balance between being thorough, but also leaving space for the things that you're going to catch and identify along the way. So let me just wrap up by saying a really good story for a proposal is one that has a relevant topic, is focused, right? Is clearly and concisely laid out, has sufficient supporting information, and has a really detailed plan and methodology for you to actually tackle. You've got a wealth of information from today's session. The potential stories are just so many. With COP27, Africa Climate Week is coming up very soon. And we will begin to focus on the expectations for COP27. By the time people go to Sharm el-Sheikh, the conversation on climate is going to be in full swing. It's a really great opportunity for us to ensure that this year's COP27 is not only based in Africa, but actually has a proper African conversation of the impacts and where we need to go from here. So let me pause there and hand back over to Bongire for the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Paula, for that practical insight as to how journalists can produce effectful and impactful proposals towards their investigations. So we've got several questions coming in, and I'm just going to start with the questions that relate to funding. So I'm going to invite all panelists, if you can just switch on your videos so that we can engage these questions. So the first one is from Jivans Miyungu. And it's directed to Matianje, but I suppose the rest of the panelists can respond as well. And the question states, you mentioned that China is shifting its funding to a smaller but profitable projects. Since the Belt and Road Initiative has in the past decade been characterized by mega infrastructure projects, how will the shift affect the BRI? And then the second question that is also related to funding that I would like us to answer in the same breath is coming from Kondwani, and that is on climate change financing. The biggest challenge in Africa is energy sources for rural communities who do not have access to electricity. What projects are designed or being designed to transfer such adaptable and low-cost energy to communities as part of China's commitment to climate change funding? So I'm going to head over to you, Matianje, to just start off the responses, and then Giraud, and then Mr. Li Shu to those questions on funding. Thank you.
Thank you for the very important question. So this whole idea of doing more so-called small but beautiful projects actually came from President Xi at the end of last year at the third symposium on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is sort of the gathering of top policymakers on this initiative. And I think it's a response definitely to the global situation where, for example, many countries are sort of at their limit of absorbing more debt-funded projects. And so I think to your question of how this will actually change the BRI, I think one of the key change that we probably might see is definitely less debt-financed projects, the projects that are financed through bank loans, right? And I think there's a general direction towards encouraging more investment, equity investment-based projects, where, for example, a Chinese entity would put in an investment as shareholder, right, of a project, which they will have more of a long-term engagement with the project, and also see through some of those projects to have actual returns on the investment. I think that's sort of the general policy direction that we are seeing from China. Whether that will actually materialize on the ground also depends on what kind of project that these investors can actually identify. But I think generally, if you look at, for example, the loans and debt that are given out by the two policy banks, they have largely just shrink to very, very low levels since at least 2016, right? So it is clear that a lot of the developing world, they don't have that capacity. If you look at what's going on in Sri Lanka, what's going to happen in Pakistan, they don't have that capacity to absorb more debt anymore. And I think China will respond to that in its Belt and Road Initiative.
Thank you for that. Giraud?
Yes, it's also an opportunity for small Chinese companies to enter the game on a very local level for local projects. We've seen the case, for example, in the DRC, where we see a consortium of Chinese, very small Chinese company building an hydropower project in a very small town in the west part of the DRC. So that's change opened opportunities for small players to come to have a very impacted project, because let's not forget that those big projects, they come with high risk, with a lot of money. It's really good politics, for the viewers. But in terms of the impact is not always felt the same way when it accesses local community directly. And for accessing those local communities directly, you need to have those small projects that are well designed, well controlled, with minimal risk, and that have really huge impact on local communities. And that even answers the question about how local communities can be impacted by those kind of changes. So yes, that's going to open the doors for small companies to come in small projects, and countries that have those local governments that are more engaged into external projects. They're going to be more active into attracting small investors, even small players into the market. So it's an opportunity to see a lot of traction on a very decentralized and very local aspect of those BRI.
Thanks for that. Mr. Lee, I can see you nodding your head. Would you like to add to that, please?
Yeah, maybe just to reinforce Gerard and Tianjie, I think our African colleagues and partners they should be prepared for shrinking Chinese appetite with regard, just to overseas activities in general. At least if you compare what will happen over the next few years to 10 years ago when the BRI started to take off. So the real question, the new questions are basically how can African countries cope with that new situation, new narrative? Can there be projects offered that could still appeal to Chinese partners? And also, knowing that there might be, it might be a different set of Chinese players that they're appealing to, right? Maybe less state-backed and more kind of private sector players. But I do think, just from a reporting point of view, I think that's kind of a new narrative. Just as a reader, I would personally be quite interested in reading more stories like that, right? A story from Chinese going big into Africa, and as a result of that, there are social, environmental and other problems to sort of a new set of stories, which is Chinese actually pulling away to some extent from the rest of the world. Is that a good or a bad thing, right? And how do we mitigate the negative impact of that in places like Africa? And just very quickly on the finance question, China has a South-South climate cooperation initiative, and under that initiative, China has provided some finance capacity building low carbon equipments to the global South. I have to say, at this stage, if you compare the Chinese initiative to more established donor countries, right, in the West, I would say the Chinese initiative is still at a very nascent stage, both in terms of its scale and just overall level of sophistication, right? So you see a lot of basically giving or donating equipments, right? The Chinese side is sort of constrained by their domestic procurement policies to just do that. You see a lot of solar, water heater in donation, LED street lights, things like that. So there's still a lot of domestic reforms that we still need to do on the Chinese side to actually make our kind of foreign aid or climate aid toolbox more sophisticated. Alongside, of course, also the need to scale up the overall level of overseas climate aid and support.
Thank you so much, colleagues, for that insight. We've also got questions that relate to how regular people, communities, or small children can be involved with climate issues. And this is a question that has come from, let me just see, David Kabombo from Tanzania, from the Peace for Conservation. And he's asking, how can we engage children on reporting and investigations on issues on climate change? And this reminds me of a interview I heard while listening to the radio yesterday of a young boy, I think who was 12 years of age, was already engaging in climate conservation, and he was participating in something of trapping pollution in local communities. And so basically, how do we involve the ordinary people to participate in climate mitigation from a local perspective, and how can we carry that as journalists to motivate for that impact and the changes that can come from that?
If I can go ahead with that question, I'd say it starts by, for small children, for very local community, it starts by education. Education is a very key component in terms of climate change today. And there is that need of training and informing local communities and small children about the impact of climate change for them to understand how climate change impacts their daily lives, their relationship with nature, for example, with pollution, with how you dispose with your garbage. I'm going to take an example of a country like Japan, where I've lived for quite some time, where you see like small children have that social responsibility in terms of pollution, in terms of how they deal with the waste management every day. So there is that need in terms of local community to also engage children, and very like any ordinary people in that debate in terms of my own personal responsibility toward climate change, how my action has an impact on my daily life, on the weather I'm living right now, on the situation I'm living right now. So education is the very starting point where we should be emphasizing it, showing at each level my own carbon print, my own responsibility, how by me using water cooler or using any kind, by me just disposing waste in a very disordered manner, how it's impacting climate change. And that's very important for me, I think.
Maybe just to quickly add, I don't have a practical answer, but just from an intellectual point of view, I do think the question is quite important for the African continent, based on two facts. One is we were talking about climate, the climate crisis today. The climate crisis is an intergeneration issue, right? In the sense that, we, adults are basically contributing to the pollutions, and the result will be suffered by people who come after us. And on the other hand, the second fact, the African continent will be the most populous continent and will be the youngest continent in the world. So how do we kind of address the youth angle based on these two facts? I think is probably a quite important issue, and could generate some interesting stories probably.
Definitely. I think we will see a lot more youth participation going forward, because a lot of young people are taking, the stance as they are the future that's going to be impacted mostly by the effects of the climate crisis. So while I have you, Mr. Lee, there's a question on on the issue of loss and damage. And the question is, why is China displaying less interest towards humanitarian appeal among countries affected by disaster, mostly in African countries? A number of countries in Africa are not meeting their appeal every year. And looking at China's contribution to greenhouse gas emissions, one would think China should be at the forefront in financing humanitarian appeal or loss and damages caused by disaster in Africa. And I guess this also relates to a question that's been asked by HP of whether is lack of funding a sign of China trying to absolve itself disaster caused by emissions. So if you can please just respond to those questions.
Sure. No, I think this has something to do with China's general position within the UN climate negotiations on issues such as providing climate aid and addressing loss and damage. And China's position there is, this is primarily the responsibilities of developed countries. And China's argument, of course, is there is a concept of, known as historical emissions, right? Industrialized countries, they started to pump greenhouse gas emissions, well, before China started to do it. And therefore, they bear the lion's share of so-called historical responsibility. Will tell us something about how effectively we will address climate problems in vulnerable countries, for example, in Africa. But it will also tell us a little bit about how China perceives its own position in the world, from a broader geopolitical point of view. So fascinating angle to keep an eye on.
Thank you for that response. I think that also answers a question that was presented by Charles Sapong on can nations be held accountable or pressured to deliver on their climate funding commitments, and if so, what have authorities done? So I think you touched on that a bit as well. So we have a hand raised by Ahmed Rahmat, but while we allow Ahmed to speak. I've got a question here for you, Jero, which reads, in the green energy transition, the DRC and Zimbabwe have witnessed a major rush for cobalt and lithium. There have been reports that those countries want the metals to be processed locally. Is that possible in the medium term? So while you put together that response, Jero, I'm just going to allow Ahmed Ramit to talk and give his question.
Yes, my question is simple that the issue of the proposal, some organizations have limitation of funding. So we'd like to know actually, there is any limitation of the funding of somebody's proposal? Thank you.
Thank you for that. I think then that question is mostly for Paula, which is on the reporting proposals, and we'll respond to that just after Jero's response.
Yes, that's a very good question, and we've reported about it before. Although DRC, Zimbabwe, even Guinea demands to have a processing plant on the ground is a legitimate demand from those producing countries. They have to address structural deficit they do have in the countries. You do have infrastructure issues that they need to overcome. They need to create enabling environment for Chinese companies to create those processing plants. For instance, today, Bloomberg has released a report last year in November that producing electrical battery in DRC is going to cost 3 times cheaper than producing it in China. This is in terms of number. But when you take into account now the political environment, the infrastructure deficits, all those kind of issues, it raised the cost of doing business in those countries, in that environment. So in the very medium short term, it's really not feasible because there is in requirements that those countries need to put in place for those Chinese companies, for Chinese investment to create processing plants on the ground. Without those prerequisites, it's going to just cost high for those companies to do processing plants in Africa, and it's going to impact the price on the international market. So in the medium term, my answer is going to be no, unfortunately for us.
Thank you for that frank and honest answer, Jero. Paula, I wonder if you got that question on the practical pitching of reporting proposals. The question was whether limitation of funding affects proposals that are submitted for consideration.
Thank you very much, Bongiwe. And so, funders traditionally have a pool of funding that they will be giving out, and so clearly there would normally be a very, very clearly defined limit in terms of how much the funder will give for a story. I think the most important thing, though, just to respond directly to that question, is that if you're asking for funding, it's really important to show what the funds are going to be used for. So if you're asking for transport, is to have a realistic transport budget. If you're asking for accommodation or for travel, you've got to show why it's important for you to travel out there and do it. If you need a fixer or a translator, all of those things need to. So even though the funder might say up to $2,000, $5,000, $10,000 for a project, the reality is that if you can't actually very clearly show that the funding is justifiable, you're unlikely to get it. And very often they are looking at a pool of applications and trying to see which of those applications they can fund. But my experience is that if you can show a really clear project plan, a really good budget that is realistic and that is detailed, that it doesn't matter really how much the amount is that you're asking for, as long as it's within the budget of the call, it should be fine.
Thank you for that response, Paula. We're running out of time and we are a bit over time, and we still have to allow for Tom Baxter to give some closing remarks, but I will allow this hand that's up to just speak to raise their question or share their comment. Suleiman Storm Koroma, you may speak.
Okay, I am from Sierra Leone, and Sierra Leone is one of the countries that are ranked prone to climate change, and the country is not doing much because we have a lot of illegal loggings that are going on, and plenty human activities that are responsible for, climate change. So I just want to have an idea of, as a journalist, should I want to undertake stories that will bring out, these issues of human interest, what sort of angles should I take that will bring more interest to the country and see how the government will tackle such?
Okay, I think, Jero, you were nodding quite a lot there. You can assist the journalist in framing that question. They want to look at it from the local perspective, even though the action is happening at the government level. How do they frame that investigation? And also, Paula, if you can pull in to this as well. And you also welcome TNG and Mr. Shu.
I think there are many angles that you can look at to that question. You have an international level where we see, in terms of illegal logging, unfortunately, we see a lot of Chinese activities in that regard. So it's how we can put as Chinese responsibility to try to give the Chinese responsibility on that situation, because we've seen many. It's not only Sierra Leone. We see that in West Africa, in Central Africa. At that point, we need to question what China is really doing on that regards, based on toward the company that's involved in those operations. So that it has a geopolitical angle that can be taken in that regard, to see how cooperation can really work on tackling those issues. For example, we had the 8th FOCAC last year. There was no specific issue where they addressed that issue, but the issue has been lingering for years and years and years, but they've never been addressed formally. So there is a need to bring it out there, to make it a very nationwide and continental issue that's become a part of the agenda between China and Africa cooperation.
So, I think that unless your publication is an analytical policy publication, I think every time we're looking at policy, we really need to be asking the story of how does this policy impact on the people on the ground? Who is it impacting on? So even if you're looking, for example, at illegal logging, what is the impact of the people of Sierra Leone? What is the impact of people across the continent? So when we're looking at these bigger stories, these bigger national stories, that we're also able to really bring it down to people. What does it mean for the people of Africa? What does it mean for the local person, etc.? And I think that's really important. Whatever story you're doing is to constantly be asking yourself, what does it mean for people on the ground?
Thank you very much for that. We're going to open up for some closing remarks, and then we're going to allow for Tom to come in. So I'm going to allow our panelists to give just some short reflection in closing, and then we're going to open the floor to Mr. Baxter. So we'll start with you, Mr. TNG.
Sure. I think it's a very good opportunity for me to hear the questions actually from the participants, because it shows where the interests are, right, from African colleagues on some of those very important issues. And I think those questions actually also shows where, like, China and its policymakers, its companies should pay attention to when they approach the continent, when they approach those countries and people. So I think I will definitely take in some of those questions and have them becoming sort of my guidance of what kind of stories we should produce at China Dialogue, what kind of lead we should follow, what kind of content we should produce, so that we can actually better answer some of those questions, particularly going forward to COP27. Yeah, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you for that. Mr. Li Shu?
Yeah, no, just very quickly, for me, just a lot of story ideas generated throughout this conversation. China's role in terms of providing climate aid to African countries. The issue of renewable energy supply chain. Can African countries play a bigger role there? What will be the implication of sort of, relatively speaking, the Chinese pull off in terms of this overseas investment and interest from Africa. So, just many kind of story ideas that we are planting here, which I also look forward to reading some of the stories, hopefully over the next few months. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Jero?
No, as for me, I just hope and expect the journalists to really break that echoing chambers for local media, because many local media in Africa have become the echoing chamber of Western narrative of China engagement in Africa. It's time for African journalists to themselves build the narrative of China engagement, involvement in Africa, and in this case, on climate change and climate mitigation. The story needs to be told from an African perspective with African touch on the ground to understand, and then we can share the narrative. As long as the narrative will always come from the West and from an external point of view, it's always going to have that geopolitical aspect that can hinder the nuance of the narrative that needs to be shared on the issue.
That's very true. Thanks for that reflection, Jero. The local perspectives and the African perspectives are very, very crucial in order for us to build out of that Western narrative that drives, the understanding, and give that local perspective and an African perspective for a much more closer investigation on these engagements as they happen on the ground. And that's one of the things we emphasize within the Africa-China Reporting Project. Paula, I'm going to allow you to go, and then I see we have so many hands going up, but unfortunately we don't have much time. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to allow one person to just raise their question. Is Tom around? I think I'll take permission from you, Tom.
Yeah, I think we should do that. It's okay. These questions have been great so far, so let's keep it going.
All right, I'll allow Zubaida Mabuno Ismail to talk. You can raise your question or comment.
Yeah, good morning, Ghana. Yes, my name is Mabuno. I'm a freelance journalist based in Ghana. I had a few questions. I had actually sent them to the Q&A, and so I'm going to ask, what is the maximum duration the grantor can offer a grantee to work on a story? I want to know the duration. That is one. I want to know how much is involved. Is it a fixed price, or they come in? I mean, depending on your proposal, the grantors decide how much to give you. I'm also asking a question about how do we get this done? Like on which platforms are we supposed to do it on our local platforms, or we can do it on international? Because some of us are freelancers and we freelance for international media houses. Can we get our stories on those platforms? This is what I want to ask. And finally, how do we apply to you? Because I don't remember coming across any call for pitches that has to do with China-African relationship. It's just this is the first time I'm seeing this on this webinar. And so how do we apply, or how do we pitch to you? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. I mean, I firstly want to just say that I think that this partnership between the Africa-China Reporting Project and China Dialogue is really an incredible opportunity for African investigative journalists to be able to apply, right, for some great climate-focused reporting grants. And to be able to do what Jero is talking about, really, which is to make sure that COP27 really has an Africa-focused dialogue, and that we're not basically repeating. I mean, there's some incredible research that shows a lot of the climate change conversations across Africa are being driven by narratives from the North. And so to be able to change that, I think, is an incredible opportunity. And so, Zubaida, but for everyone else, I mean, the various donors operate in different ways, and an Africa-China Reporting Project makes a very definite call for proposals, and I would say that you need to be following it, and you need to be keeping tabs on its website in order to be there. Other organizations have rolling grant applications where you can go and when you have a good story, you can make an application. Others have very specific calling period times where they will call in January and they will call in June. And so it depends very much on that. I just want to say, though, that I mean, the African newsrooms have been pretty decimated by COVID, and a lot of the really good storytelling that we've been able to do has been supported by donor funded. Each of them have different criteria. Each of them have a different submission requirements, and so it's not possible for me, Sabeda, to say what the different submission requirements are. What I will say to you, though, is that be very intentional about what you're applying for. Make sure that it meets the requirements of the funder whose call you are responding to. But most importantly, make sure that the story you're telling is worth telling and worth being funded. This is not something that you're going to apply for run-of-the-mill stories. These are critical stories that need to be told if you want somebody to actually be funding it. And I'm going to leave it there and say, there is a lot of competition for donor funding. Do your homework, do your preparation, make sure that you are actually both in terms of the grant application, but also in terms of the stories you want to tell.
Thank you so much, Paula, for that response. And thank you to our panelists, Matianji, Lee Shua, Jeronima. Thank you so much for the informative, insightful reflections on Africa-China relations within the climate crisis. It's really been very insightful, informative, and judging from all the questions and comments that we've been getting, unfortunately, we could not respond to all of them, but we'll do our best to respond in the report that will follow this webinar, where we're going to include the presentations that our speakers gave and also the recording of this session. So with that, thank you to everyone who's joined us. And I'll hand over now to Tom Baxter to give the final reflections before we formally close the session. Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Bongowe, and thanks all the panelists and everyone for joining and the fantastic questions. I'm Tom Baxter. I'm Global China Editor with China Dialogue, with a large focus on Africa. So a lot of the questions that have been raised today are areas that I work on with my colleagues too. Just very briefly, let's try and finish on the hour here. I thought I'd give a quick kind of overview of everything we discussed today, because there was a lot. And then just a few comments about this kind of area of work that we're all engaged in. So firstly, today from Giraud, I think we heard very well about the challenges and the opportunities for Africa in terms of climate and energy. That's climate impacts, which we're already feeling, the need for energy and the need for economic development, and also opportunities when it comes to things like critical mineral resources. He made a very good point, which I think is extremely interesting and deserves more attention, about how going forward, critical minerals must not just be an extractives model of mining, but also bring value chains to the African continent. And of course, China plays a massive role in all of those above issues as a major investor in Africa. Tianjie demonstrated how complex China is as an actor, how complex China's domestic situation is, and also China's involvement in Africa, and really emphasized the importance of embracing that complexity in our reporting and providing accurate information. And through that information will inform a better discussion and hopefully down the line, better policy making. And Li Shuo gave us a great overview of COP27, which I think is on all of our minds. And I think a lot of the attendees will be reporting on this year and hopefully attending. Particularly demonstrating that this year in the COP, there's kind of two major imbalances that will come to the fore. I think will come up in reporting a lot. So this tension between mitigation and adaptation, and between ambition and climate finance. And climate finance is a huge issue, of course. From Paula, we heard some very practical advice about applying for ACRP's reporting grants. But I'd say that advice is also relevant to your pitches to any media houses. So that was really useful. And if I can just quote Paula, I think she said something excellent, which we can all focus on, is there's a need for us over the next couple of months to make sure that COP27 is not just the COP that's based in an African country, but that it's a COP that really acts as a platform for a conversation about climate driven by Africa, bringing across African perspectives. And I think that can be a kind of mission to any of us who are reporting on Africa or publishing on Africa over the next few months. So I wanted to say, let's be forthright. Writing on Africa and China and the climate is by no means straightforward. It's a very complex issue. China is extremely complex. Africa, of course, is extremely complex. And we also come up against what Giraud summarized as an echo chamber, where we're coming up against these kind of preconceived notions of what China is, of what Africa is, and it can be difficult to break down those boundaries. But it's extremely important to do so. Doing so will provide us a better foundation for dialogue on these issues, will provide us more accurate information, more facts, and can really impact on how policies are implemented, how policies came about, and what our governments can really do. And the kind of conversations we've had today, I think, are a big part of working together to try and improve coverage on this space. So we've been really happy since China Dialogue and ACRP started this section of work with our grants. We've been really excited about how much energy there has been around this topic. And we saw it today with, we've had over 100 participants in this call. We've had more questions than we can get round to, but these are all basis for further conversation. So we will continue these conversations. We will continue this line of work. And I think through these discussions and also through doing these reports that we're all working on, we can really improve this space and help each other learn. So I want to say thanks to our panelists, Ma Tianjie in Beijing and Li Shuo in Beijing, to Geronima and to Paula Frey. Thanks to all of the participants. It's been great having you here and seeing all your questions. And in particular, thanks to Bongawei and the ACRP team for facilitating this event and helping put it all together. And I think with that, we can all get back to our busy reporting days and get down to business. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.